I would like to discuss with you what happens when we leave behind the 11,700 years of the Holocene, the 11,700 years of architecture, you might think, of settlements, of cities, agriculture, and we enter the new geological epoch of the Anthropocene. What are the conditions in front of us? What are the conditions under our feet, above our heads in the atmosphere, and how can we mobilize architectural thinking and architectural intelligence to somehow handle some of the complications and maybe sort out some of the complications that the Anthropocene poses. And before I will start, I would really like to understand what is the status of the discussion on the Anthropocene in Innsbruck. Does anybody work on the Anthropocene here? Does anybody know what the Anthropocene is? 2, 3, 4. Does anybody know what the Holocene is? So the Holocene is a geological epoch, 11,700 years, which is characterized by mountains being eroded by glaciers and by the melting of the snow, by precipitation. Everything that you think is the geological background is the Holocene, which means the new recent or the new whole, depending on how you interpret this, which is a very complex strata of the Earth. It's a very complex strata that is mainly given by sedimentation and erosion processes. The Anthropocene is a term posited by a fantastic hero of the 20th century, a very rarely sung hero, Paul Crutzen, who is the Nobel Prize winner for chemistry for his work on atmospheric chemistry, in particular for the work on the ozone layer. And you might remember the enormous efforts to stop the ozone depletion. And what Paul Crutzen does in the year 2000 in a group of in a meeting of the International Biosphere program is to stop the speakers and say, this is no longer tenable. What you're describing, the framework of your description of the interaction between the geosphere and the biosphere are no longer valid, because today we're no longer in the epoch of the Holocene. We have changed the world so much, we have changed the planet so much that we have to consider the Anthropocene. So this is the main framework that I would like to discuss with you this evening. The Anthropocene is a geological epoch shaped by human activities, shaped by us, shaped by our parents, maybe even by our grandparents, but not much beyond that. It's really the last generations, changing so much the Earth that the carbon cycle has been modified, the nitrogen cycle has been modified, to the point that the amount of stuff that we move, that humans move, is 15.5 times bigger in magnitude than the amount of stuff moved by glaciers, by oceans, by rivers, by wind. So 15.5 times bigger than the Holocene. The amount of energy that each one of us uses is at a level of 100 times bigger than any moment previously conceived. So my expose this evening will try to understand this transition, this leaving behind the rather stable period, 11,700 years of more or less warm, stable, temperate climate of the human civilization. You can imagine that as architects, you study maybe the last 500 years. If you're really interested, you can go back 1,000, 2,000, really the pyramids is 3,500 years ago. And then there's a big gap of 7,000 years where we just have archaeological traces of the first cities. But definitely, it's a moment where humans have settled, have shaped our civilization. So that's the reference. What I would like to propose tonight is an idea that the Anthropocene can be understood as a transformation of the relation between polities and our space of operation. And I would like to start really with basic understanding. Is an idea of building dams, organizing large infrastructural works to provide irrigation, reshaping and intensifying the operations, for instance, in the plains of the birth of civilization, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Mesopotamian river system, characterized really by the slow flow of the rivers, the sediments, the clay that is sedimented, out of which you produce the very building materials of architecture, the bricks, the kilns, and the organization of, let's say, the human environment, the particular formation through which humans settle and organize that. The fires of burning and trying to produce the bricks is now reverberating with the airstrikes on the same landscapes. This is rather old now. It's almost 15 months ago, the first airstrike of the US on or against ISIS, with the hitting of the dam, the construction of this large-scale Assad Lake that provides electricity and irrigation farming means to the population of modern Syria, sponsored largely by the non-aligned movement engineers from Novi Sad, from Serbia, with large influences of an idea of an international architecture. Today, the very international architecture of the rapid modernization of the Holocene is claimed as a weapon by many of what we might consider our enemies. This is an analysis of the Tigris and Euphrates. In red, you see everything that is reflected in the spectrum and the radiomagnetic spectrum by basically what undergoes a photosynthetic regime. Basically, everything that is vegetation is reflected and detected by infrared sensors by Landsat. And over 30 years, we've analyzed the transformation, the slow transformation of the environment. So you see in white the Tigris and Euphrates, this black spot over here. Do I have a laser pointer? Do you have a laser pointer? No. This black spot over here is Baghdad, just so that you can orient yourself. The other black spot on the left is the Mediterranean. In red is the vegetation, and some of the Assad Dam is here. Good. Thanks a lot. Assad Dam. And what you see in red, in different intensities of red, are the variations of vegetation over the last 30 years in the north of Syria, south of Turkey, northwest of Iraq. This is probably the only visible border from satellite. It's the border between Turkey and Syria. And in the north, of course, you see the rich vegetation in bright red. In the southern part, you see the depleting vegetation in darker red, and everything in between, and the intensification of irrigation. And this is part of the largest project to transform Turkey, which is called the Great Anatolian Project, which I hope you might be interested in looking into, the transformation of the entire organization of the environment of the war of the last 15 years. So the transformation of global war is not only urban warfare, let's say the construction of guerrilla and counter insurgency tactics that operate really in the urban and built environment. Is completely embedded and enmeshed in a very complex reorganization of the threshold line between the desert and vegetation, between the settlement of agricultural structures, villages, small towns, and this larger transformation of the hydrological landscapes by long-term and slow violence. So this is the moment through which you start understanding probably that the schemes through which modern architecture, in particular modernist architecture, try to relate knowledge production with how to deal with an environment starts being tricky. It starts being maybe shaky. This is an amazing little sketch that is at the beginning of a wonderful book called Echistics by Konstantinos Doxiadis, who epitomizes modernist architecture and planning. And it links the forces shaping human settlements. So the more divergent forces are then recombined, stabilized, then they are reshaped again by external factors coming in, and constant ideas that you can imagine that there the city is very stable, here it gets somehow unsettled, and then stabilizes, unsettles, stabilizes, and now we are here, the present. This is 1961, shaped by multiple forces: modernization, rapid industrialization, reconnections of and tucking into different cultures, different polities, and beneath, knowledge about human settlements. There we have 100% knowledge, 0% knowledge. I don't know what that means, but it's a beautiful idea. The more you know, the better you live, the more stable you live. So you go up and down, and here we don't know much about what's going on. And of course, the underlying idea is that we have to know more in order to act better. And this modernism, the very notion that you have to take charge of our environment through architecture, through the organization of human activities, the stabilization of activities, somehow it reminds us of architecture as a long-term investment with human inhabitation of our environment. The point is, of course, that the more we know, the more we intensify. And the more we intensify, the more the planet hits back at us. And so this is now a situation that we are entering into, where agency is no longer tenable only with humans. The separation between the Earth system and the world system, between the Earth as a planet, the blue marble, and the spaces of operation, say, of the globe, not of the planet, but of the globe, is now no longer possible to keep separate. The bringing back of the two is in front of us. It's in front of us in the changing patterns of precipitation, in the changing pattern of irrigation, of the wind patterns. The climate is moving. The Earth is moved. It's no longer that it is moving, the planet is moved by us. This is a diagram that you all know. It's the IPCC the observation on the northern hemisphere of the rising temperature of from the 1900 datum. Just to understand, this here is the French Revolution. Those of you born after 1985 will never have experienced one single year of your life which was colder than anyone on record before. This is the Anthropocene. And the predictions, of course, is that we are going to change everything. Our science is very clear. Our computer models are very clear. We are entering a system of rapid oscillations of the Earth system. But of course, we are also entering a system of rapid oscillation of the world system, of society, of economies, of politics. And this is just to remind us of the long-term curves of the Kondratiev waves, not only the business cycles, but the long investment of ups and downs of prices, and something that is well beyond our individual capacity of action, but it's somehow a societal condition of an economy. That's, let's say, the middle of a very long introduction to what the Anthropocene actually is doing. Beginning of the Industrial Revolution, global energy consumption, that is the sum of consumption of energy of every single element of the world system. So, including transport, including shipping, the entire energy consumption of the world. Since I'm born, 1970, it has more than doubled. The amount of energy that each one of us uses, as I indicated before, is no longer comparable to what urban situation that we still like and enjoy was meant for. Now, the amount of energy, the footprint, the technosphere characterization of human activities today is well beyond our understanding. Maybe what is more interesting is to look at not the overall, the total amount, which we count here in exajoules, 600 million joules. This is the comparative energy consumption. So the sum is always 100. So we see here the depletion of energy usage for biomass. That means cutting wood in order to sustain our economy. We no longer really run an economy just by cutting the wood and heating our homes. No, the rise of coal, the rise of oil, the very quick rise of gas, the nuclear renewables is this thin line down there. What is interesting, of course, for anybody who's interested in architecture is to understand the almost direct correlation between energy consumption and forms of structuring of the city. We go from pre-industrial city-states, just before here, completely dominated by wood consumption, to the rise of the national states, parliamentarian organizations. The territory is organized in a completely different intensification. You have to move so much more. You have to coordinate so much more. You set up institutions, academies of science, academy of architecture to somehow organize and structure that usage and that thrust towards the excess of energy that coal gives and the steam engine. And then internal combustion engine that very quickly takes off after the discoveries of Rockefeller in 1910s, 1940, the quick depletion in World War II, and then boom, skyrockets, and now it's stable in its percentage. The point is that all of this sums up to that quick the rapid acceleration since 1950, which then emits too much carbon, which creates the problem. The point is, it's no longer possible to disjoin that with the crisis of the world system. It's no longer possible to disjoin the Earth from the world. Not possible to think that, for instance, our economy, the euro crisis, is completely something that we can manage and organize as a society, maybe well formed and well structured by a good built environment, while the Earth is moving back to us. So this is where I really wanted to bring in the role of architecture, the way through which architectural thinking and architectural intelligence, if we can call it that, there's not much, unfortunately, deals with these issues. We've seen the curves. We can imagine that what is at stake is a particular formation of a territory, the particular formation through which we attach ourselves to what keeps us alive, the particular organization, the particular composition of things that sustains our life. That's a territory. You can imagine a territory of an eagle. The alpine eagle has its own territory that looks down at the different ferrets and very clearly defined as a set of relation between observation, analysis of the environment, and attempts to maintain a life. What is interesting is that territory is, for us, always linked to land. We somehow misjudge its origin, its its etymology. Territory is not terra. Territory is terror, to terrere, to deter, to warn off, to stop people, no? To manage conditions through which you don't allow people in because you want to be alive. You don't want others to come in. And you don't want the wolf to join your assembly. You don't want the... and the wolf is interesting because it always appears unannounced. Like now in the middle of the lecture, there's a wolf that determines the barrier, the border of our territory. The territory is not land, it's not a thing, it's a set of relations. Exactly like architecture is a set of relations. It's a set of a very complicated ways through which we attach ourselves to things, to stuff, and to ourselves. And this is where really I wanted to have a discussion maybe with you afterwards. The idea of territory is today entering our understanding of what is at stake for architecture. We start maybe by looking at the very conditions of inhabitation. This is the enclosures of the British landscapes. No? What happens at the rise of the domination of the city over the countryside, where the cities and the capitalist system starts dominating larger and larger structures. What happens is a complete reformation of land structures, of way through which we inhabit what used to be the commons. What you have is the expulsion of population from the land, enclosure of land, private property, the landed gentry in Britain, and the reorganization of villages and stabilization of what the English still like, no? The rolling hills of England. Seen here no longer just as a formation of a landscape, but as a mobilization of a population from its land outwards onto larger and larger organization of inhabited spaces, the rise of small cities, each one of which are autonomous in their organization, autonomous in their form, or autonomous in the management, in the government of the Holocene. And then, of course, the idea of good government, bad government, the role of the city dominating and shaping our Holocene. Simultaneously, we have the rise of corporations. We have the rise of a new form of sovereignty. We have the rise of new form of architecture, which takes the idea really from nature. What happens is the rise of a new form of representation of us. Architecture starts really collaborating with other forms of representation in order to detach ourselves from nature. And this is, of course, the idea of the still life, the Treaty of Utrecht, and the representation of still life in the Netherlands at the same time. Reorganization of the cities, domination of the landscape, and of course colonialism. Rapid intensification of connections across the oceans. We go and meet our friends in China. We establish possibilities of operation there. And this is contemporary China. So this is the south coast of China. In black here you see the island of Formosa, Taiwan. This is the Pearl River Delta. Hong Kong is that little thing there. In the different colors are there to indicate transformations at different years. You can imagine that it's a series of analyses that we're doing at Territorial Agency, trying to detect hard surfaces. Let's say what constitutes architecture, but at a slightly different level of coherence, maybe slightly larger than usually architecture is thinking of. So, and we take over 3 decades images in 87, 91, basically Tiananmen. 2000 is the World Trade Organization. 2012 is the reorganization of the relationship across the Strait of China. Then we sum up the images, and what comes out in the 3 years appears in different shades of white or gray, because it's always present. But what is only present in 1990 appears red. What is only present in the second take is green, and blue, of course, is the recent one. What we start seeing is like an onion. No? This is Macau, the historical center of Macau. In green, the extension in the 90s. In blue, the contemporary forms of inhabitation. Transforming completely the riverbed, the construction of high-speed railways, reorganization of highways. What is interesting is that nothing happens around this infrastructure. You build the infrastructure, think that you're going to connect and reorganize what used to be the texture of a city, but nothing. No, you just build more and more. No? And this is basically the footprint of architects, mainly from the West, projecting onto China all our, say, imaginaries and our repressed ambitions. And this is the clear example of the very rapid growth through the mobilization of the rural population of China into cities, and now that the crisis is looming in China, they don't know where to go. No, they don't have any longer cheap labor that can come, so they are trying to extend cheap labor from Southeast Asia, Philippines, Indonesia, and so on, but they all get stuck in this very short-term building environment. No? Towers where nobody can speak to each other. It's going to be tough to recuperate socially from the housing boom of China, which is starting to operate. No? The entire production schemes of contemporary world production is engulfed not only in the transformation of the built environment of China, but it's really extending to the case, and the case is really, I think, there and made that the organization of the Earth system is completely changed. What happens is that in choke points of the supply system, you encounter more and more militarization. In red here you see all the pirate attacks, for instance, Hormuz and the Suez Canal, and the migration patterns from the Sub-Sahara into the Mediterranean, climbing up, live on television, and we only mobilize ourselves once they actually enter our background, our back door, maybe. And this is really where I think architecture can teach us something. First of all, because all of this is designed. All of this doesn't happen as a side effect. All of this is intentional. All of this is carefully planned. All of this is carefully articulated, and we are all part of it. Nobody is a victim any longer. It's no longer north and south, east and west. Everyone is a victim of this. So it's so difficult to distinguish who we are and who they are, because somehow we are all together. And we're a situation where it's really complicated to rearticulate a condition of, let's say, establishing spatial relation, of establishing a territory. What is it that keeps us alive rather than other people? Let's make an example. Are we talking about India having an idea of development based on the Western idea of development, as it is done now 5 weeks ago in Paris? No? Modi takes on responsibility and says, no one is going to stop me from burning coal. I'm going to build my cities, I'm going to build my motorway, this enormous and construction boom of India, and I'm going to do it exactly like the West has done, because the West has taken my resources 150 years ago with colonization. Is that a tenable position? Is that recrimination of being the victim something that is going to allow in any form the Indian citizens to survive? So what brings us really center stage is an idea of an architecture of independence, which is tightly connected with the international. And the international is a beautiful neologism by the person who architects like to quote a lot because of the panopticon, Jeremy Bentham. And he liked all these neologisms, and he didn't like the idea of law just being referred to as law of nations. He thought that it was not clearly expressing a new condition of the new mechanized world that he was living in. And in 1785, he writes a beautiful essay where he proposes to call the rise of international space as a new space. No? The international, he calls it. And the international accelerates the Anthropocene through this meeting in the very cold waters of the North Atlantic. This is August 1941. Actually, it's very complicated. Just before the attacks on Pearl Harbor. And this is, of course, Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And in the background, you see a ship on which there is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they meet and they set out the basis for our contemporary organization of the international, the Atlantic Charter. They found basically the United Nations, which is the allies that are joining forces against the terror of the Nazi regime. And they proposed that every single nation should be independent, they should have access to their own resources, and they should be able to freely trade resources. And this is the birth of the Atlantic Charter. At sea, exactly like the colonial system is at sea. What happens is, of course, that the newly established United Nations after the war is basically a gigantic hall with a lot of free seats because there's not so many nations. So we have to create nations in order to fill them, all those seats. And the first independent colony is, of course, Ghana. And you can imagine the entire impetus of architecture to go and build the new independent nation. And again, Konstantinos Doxiadis goes and builds a large part of those areas. You can imagine another amazing independent country is India, which undergoes an amazing process of radical violence and with a partition. And they decide to partition India according to religion. And they Muslim on one side and all the others on the other side. So you have to suddenly relocate the capital of Punjab. Let's build a new city and let's call it Chandigarh. And so on and so forth. Now, architecture is deeply involved into this process, and everything that we love about modern architecture, its capacity of civil enthusiasm, its capacity of organizing the very spaces of cohabitation is now completely engulfed and reshaped by the Anthropocene. The coast of the West Africa is basically one gigantic city, probably the largest city in the world, which is deeply connected to migration patterns both to it and from it, and very complicated connection to climate change, to desertification processes, to land grab, and to, of course, armed conflicts. What happened over the weekend in Burkina Faso is just one part of the extended land grab system of the Anthropocene. The Nigerian Delta is hosting maybe the hub of this gigantic push of population downwards towards the sea. And the desertification is the pull factor that we call, Europe is so fantastic, we are pulling all these people out. Actually, we are creating the very conditions through which the migration across the desert happen. It's a push factor happening through the land grab in order to have soya milk, in order to have our nice, comfortable homes. We are creating this very complicated system. So what is the condition through which architecture can then claim any part in any possible solution once we've been so deeply involved in creating a problem? No? This is Kwame Nkrumah entering the UN, greeted by Jordan, Nigeria, Romania, Tunisia, India. In the background, somewhere up there, there's a very grumpy Eleanor Roosevelt who doesn't like what she's seeing. Maybe she doesn't like the black man, but all the other people are middle-aged, mainly men. What is interesting is that, again, we are encountering the post-colony. We're encountering the very notion through which architecture sets out to establish the domination of the city towards the country. Not only the organization of the gridded plantations of, let's say, the past, but contemporary gridded plantations of palm oil, the contemporary organization of our very supply systems. If you like Kit Kat, you can imagine that the Kit Kat is actually shaped by palm oil, which is based on land grab in Indonesia, which is based on burning the forest, killing all the orangutan. And this is the major catastrophe that has happened in the last 50 years, and nobody talks about it. What are these lines? What are these partitions? What is the impetus of reorganization? How do we encounter this system? So this is what I wanted to really discuss with you this evening. I wanted to show you maybe a quick clip from, is there sound here? How do I do the sound? Doesn't seem to work. Because I cannot control the output. It worked before, maybe here. It's not a big deal. Doesn't matter. You can imagine that it makes a lot of noise. This is environmental control. I understand that the entire campus here is going through an amazing transformation driven by environmental control. Air conditioning is now no longer en vogue. This is a place called El Ejido in the south of Spain, on the Mediterranean coast. It's where your lettuce, where your tomatoes come from. And it's the single largest farm in Europe. And it's also called the Sea of Plastic. And it allows, of course, migration to be absorbed into Europe as form of direct involvement in the production of the common agricultural policy. And it has completely transformed a big part of the coast of Spain, very close to the other part of the coast of Spain that has been transformed by tourism and the towers and all the, say, cheap seasonal tourism along the Costa Brava and so on. What is particular of this kind of landscape is that it's no longer an exterior. It's completely closed off. It's a huge architecture. It's really like a lab. What happens is that it's not any longer possible to distinguish a laboratory of, let's say, Syngenta or any other company involved in the maintenance of the very fine environment from what is contemporary agriculture, what is contemporary forms of production, of the means of sustainment of contemporary life. So this is a view from above. This is, of course, Armin Linke and part of the work on the Anthropocene Observatory that has been running as a platform for research over the last 2.5 years, almost the third year now. First at the Huis der Culturen der Welt, and then in Utrecht, and now it's going to be developed in a new format that we'll soon announce. The formation of that space are no longer just, say, an issue of an attempt to say that we need to be more ecological. The next part of the presentation looks at not at the south of the coast of Europe, of the peninsula of Europe, but tries to mirror what is happening in the migration across the Mediterranean in the north. This is an image that shows all the empires that have tried to somehow control this line, which is the Alpine ridge. The Alps are not just the Central Alps, it's not just the mountains that we so much love. No, I'm born in the Alps, it's my environment. It's not just that part. The Alpine chorography is a very complex set of geomorphic condition that stretches all the way to the Himalaya. The Himalaya is the same morphological structure as the Alps. Of course, with a big push of the subcontinent bumping into Asia. It's no longer possible to claim that we need to be in touch with nature, that we need to align our knowledge, our production of architectural skills with the complex dynamics of ecology, for a very simple reason, and that our very concept of nature, the biosphere, is formed by these two people, and it's a major industrial concept. The biosphere, formed by Vernadsky and his friend Krugman, here indicated of the Soviet project of living rationally with nature. 1926, the book appears after a long period through which Vernadsky really tries to shape the way through which the industrialized, newly formed state, organization of, say, modern architecture, modern lifestyle, modern industry, modern forms of cohabitation is engulfed this. And one of the elements that is at the center of the biosphere is a very complex concept that divides the geosphere from the biosphere from the noosphere, which is the sphere of human knowledge, which we have to establish and commonly join into in order to rationally connect to the biosphere and to the form of life, is conjoined with the establishment of science cities across the steppe, across the Eurasian continent by the Soviet Union. This is an image of a collaborator of Vernadsky, who goes up to Murmansk, establishes the Kola Science Center, which is responsible for the organization both of the science and the establishment, let's say, of the geoengineering aspect of industrialization. They managed to form the single largest experiment in habitation of the 20th century. We can forget, say, Chandigarh. We have to look at Murmansk, a city of almost 1 million people in the Arctic, organized around geology, organized around very complex scientific endeavors, organized around the rise of technology, which is at the basis of our telecommunication system, all then emphasized and institutionalized with the largest rush, which is both upwards towards the moon and downwards. So at the same time, you can imagine the Apollo mission fighting against the Soviet cosmonauts in order to reach the rocks of the moon, in order to understand better our cohabitation of the Earth. And at the same time, the rush towards understanding the crust of the Earth. And of course, nobody remembers that the losers of the space race, we remember, say, Armstrong going on the moon. We don't remember why they went there to bring back the rocks. They are now in Houston. We also don't remember the losers of the race downwards, which are the Americans, because the race downwards was won by the construction of the Kola super deep borehole, which is still today the deepest borehole in the world, which was meant to provide new science about the organization of the upper crust. And it's really in the further north elements of the Arctic Russia, in the European Euroscandic plateau, let's say the Finno-Scandic extents of the Kola Peninsula, where the industrial Soviet Union pushed all its might. Today, it looks like this.
This heavily and 30 kilometers in length is the quarries and mines. And we produce plastic And when we produce glass up to 1,000 tons of glass materials every week, this glass. And in the central part of Hidden, here, we average two experimental blasts, nuclear blasts. In 1983, the two nuclear blasting was made in the central part of Hidden, and one blast and 400,000 tons of rock was destroyed. It's a world record. So, when we produce blasting, we produce earthquakes. And this settlement sometimes have a possibility to be destroyed. So it's necessary remove settlement from mines. We remove settlement, it's necessary to arrange roads. And so step by step, we develop our area from small mine, small settlement area. Biggest in the world mines or in the mountain, and big and very convenient, very suitable for living settlement.
So what is interesting is our reaction to this. Nobody really believes any longer in this. Modernity is something that we no longer really can inhabit, exactly because the winning effort against nature is something that we really understand is no longer tenable. So the distinction between, let's say, a thrust of establishing a clear-cut definition and distinction between the past and the future, the bad and the good, the winner and the loser, is no longer something that we can so clearly identify with. And of course, our friend Bruno Latour would say, that's only because we've never been modern. We've only pretended that we were detached from nature, that we could establish that clear-cut distinction between us and it, where it is obviously architecture, fields, organization of colonies, mobilization of slave trade, and so on. So the question about where to reconnect, how to reorganize our territories, how to reestablish a clear, very identifiable and explicit relation between our relation to the others is now encountering a major problem, and that is given by the fact that territories are now open on all sides. It's no longer possible to keep them, to close off, to enter a situation of, say, settled architecture. Humanity is on the move, and humanity is on the move in a very strange way. It's on the move through intensities, no longer through extension, no longer land is available in front of us. The Anthropocene, this new land of our Earth, is not a new continent yet again to be conquered through our engineering skills. It changes in intensity. This is the amazing city of St. Petersburg / Leningrad, depending how you look at it. We tend to think it's just a different name of the same city across the stage. It's actually 3 different cities. You have Petersburg in the middle, along the canals. Then you have Leningrad and St. Petersburg as the largest. The modernist Leningrad engulfing the industrial ring. It's no longer even the extension of modern architecture in the Randstadt, the center of modern and modernist urban development of Europe, where the intensifications and the reorganizations of the polders, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, is so complex. It's no longer something that we can organize in clear sways, in homogeneous moves. Organization of what keeps us alive is no longer possible to simply outline. Territories weigh down on each other. They are complex. They need to be understood as a very unstable situation where there's no arbiter, there's no possibility of clarifying, of identifying a clear orientation. This is an image of it's a series of images of metropolitan regions in Europe. This is Madrid. Again, you see the 3 colors, reframe. extension of the periphery in the early 90s. You might remember the push to the compact city at the beginning of the 90s, and suddenly everybody was a little bit worried that we might not maintain the city within our public spaces, squares, and that was what you can see there in red, trying to compact the city. In green, the extension of the early 2000s with the push to infrastructure, to build new highways, new sites of circulation, even the high-speed railway, Atocha in the middle, which reminds us of terror, and the new ring in blue, the unfinished boom of construction that leads to a huge problem, because you cannot just say build your way out of the financial crisis. It's already built, it's already done, it's already there, it's empty, it cannot do anything, and it organizes change as a modernist onion, one thing after the other. It's very difficult to reoccupy and so on. More detailed version, again, Spain. This is really an act of love towards the Spanish city, and this is Barcelona. That's how we understand Barcelona is basically a champe there. This is probably contemporary Barcelona. Transformation of the city inside the Plan Cerdà are very interesting because they appear stable. The city somehow homogenizes its transformation. They happen internally. It's not visible in the city. What is visible is the expansion of the airport, the construction of the new harbor, the possibilities actually of trying to connect it back to the national railway system, the problematic negotiation with the national government, the notions of establishing a independent Catalonia really doesn't match the ambitions of European interconnection, because suddenly you don't manage to bring all the goods that the Chinese ship into here out into the system. So these are some of the elements that I wanted to show you tonight. Maybe, let me see if I have. Paris, the center of urbanity. The périphérique, the construction of the major infrastructural axis. The thing over here is, what do you call it? Euro Disney. Charles de Gaulle Airport up there, the National Stadium, that's where the bomb went off. The very complex reorganization of the expansion of modern structures of cohabitation in Europe. London, Liverpool. What is at stake today, and I'm going to end here, is discontinuity, in different intensification, different ways for which we measure. Every single image that I've shown you today has its origin in an ecological approach and simultaneously in a military approach to life, to the environment. And today it's possible to think that the cosmopolis, the possibilities of establishing a unified Earth is no longer tenable. It's no longer possible to think the international space of cohabitation through a cosmopolitan idea. Cosmopolis is no longer sharing the same cosmos. We no longer share the same Earth. We have different approaches to Earth, each one of which is competing with the other. It's in very complex negotiation with the other. And I'm not so sure that architecture, that the built environment as we understood it, in its complex stratification, sedimentation, morphological structures, the long tenure of, for instance, the Italian city. This is amazing city in very close to Rome. That's the papal, the summer palace of the Pope, no? Rocca di Papa. It's no longer possible for us to really think that that could be the way forward. Somehow we become more and more disenchanted towards this, and the only thing that I wanted to finish with is this very gray idea that what we have to engage with as architects is a new form of cosmopolitics. It's no longer the politics of, as transformation of the city, as transformation of the domination of the city towards the earth. We have to take into consideration the fact that the earth is far more active than we are. The glacier has far more agency than we have. The melting of the ice is far more active than we've ever wished we could be, in spite of the fact that we are moving it. And this places us in a very awkward situation. It's like a Möbius strip of both being looking ahead and being completely caught from the back from what we've tried to achieve. And this is where basically I wanted to outline our research on the possibilities of thinking architecture as a very complex set of relations between us and things, as an architectural intelligence vis-à-vis the transforming landscapes of the Anthropocene. Thank you.